Hi, I'm Dustin, pastor of Hope Church here in Simons Valley, and welcome to our online service today. I'm just so excited that you decided to join us for worship today. This morning we're having our service online on both YouTube and Facebook at 10:30, and then today at 4 o'clock we're having a celebration service for our church. Our church turns 2 years old this weekend, and so we are having an outdoor service to celebrate. So for those of you who would like to join us and feel comfortable doing so, we're going to be meeting at 4 p.m. at Bears Paw Christian School to just kind of celebrate. We have the same sermon and the worship songs together. Everyone will be spread out on the field. We got a little treat for everyone who's coming, but just want to invite you, if you would like to continue watching this and then join us in person at 4. We'd love to have you at Bears Paw Christian School. Also, if you're a first-time guest with us, we'd love to just get to know you a little bit more and see if we can maybe answer some questions for you about our church and let you know more of what we are doing. And so we have an online Connect card. The link is there in the description. You can click that and fill that card out, and we will be happy to just get connected with you, answer your questions, and let you know more about who we are as a church, what we do, and how you can be involved as well. Also, every week, our worship pastor, C-Sung, he puts together a YouTube set list for you to use to worship there at home. And so after the sermon is done, just go ahead and click that YouTube link and go ahead and sing along with the 2 songs that he has selected for today's service. So moving to Canada 3.5 years ago was my very first taste of being an immigrant or an alien in another country. I've never really traveled that much before. I never had lived anywhere other than my hometown or the city that my wife and I lived in, which was only about 2 hours from my hometown where my parents were. So I never really lived anywhere else and didn't really travel that much. But we moved to Calgary about 3.5 years ago. My wife and I and our then almost 2-year-old son Kirk, who is now 5. But when we moved here, I had to get a new driver's license. I had to figure out a new healthcare system. I had to get lost trying to figure out my way around town in a new area. I also had to, because of my accent and people finding out I was from the U.S., had to answer the same question several times of whether I was a political refugee seeking asylum in Canada because Trump became president of my home country. And the reason they asked is because we literally moved a week after his inauguration. So I had to answer that question many, many times. But after some time, we started to realize that just having a work permit brings some limitations. We are not citizens of this country that we are now in, and so we had to figure out some things. It's a little bit different. So it was my first time feeling like I was an outsider. I was an immigrant planting my life here, but at the very beginning, we really didn't know a lot of people. We didn't know a lot. We didn't know what the good restaurants were in the area. We didn't know the best place to go get our groceries, and it just took us time to learn. And many of you have experienced the same thing as you've moved to another city or country as well, and you've had to go through that initial time of just kind of figuring out what it means to really feel and live as an immigrant. But God graciously brought us many great friends here in our community in the first few months that we lived here, and those friends helped us start Hope Church and have become like family to us. And now Calgary is home. It is home for our family, and we can't see ourselves living anywhere else, and I don't feel like an alien anymore. But the book of 1 Peter is all about helping Christians live in our current world as aliens or exiles, because our true home is heaven, not really earth. In a way, we don't belong here on earth. Our hearts long for something more than this life has to offer. Our bodies can't wait to be made perfect and whole as they should be, and our minds dream of the day where we don't have to worry about stress and anxiety and all these things that just weigh our minds down, and we long for that because we know that earth, this time now, is not our forever home. And so this is how we are like aliens or immigrants, whether we are in our home country or not. As Christians, we don't really belong here. And we feel that sometimes. And just like I gained a new perspective on how to adjust living in Calgary, in Canada, we need a different perspective on how to live our present lives wherever God has placed us, whether it's here in Calgary or maybe you're watching from somewhere else. So when you're not from a country, you have to kind of choose one of 3 different perspectives to have. And I liked how Pastor J.D. Greer outlined this and explained this in his sermon on this very same passage. He said there are 3 basically perspectives you can have. The first is the perspective of an immigrant. You're not from here, but you've made this place your new permanent home. And this is what a lot of Christians do with the world. They live as citizens of this world and treat this world as if it is their permanent home. So they are really concerned with how things are going down here. They leverage most of their resources to make a comfortable life here, and they worry about their reputation here. They're worried about what they might miss out on here. It's a wrong perspective for a Christian in this world. And the second perspective you can have, he says, you can choose to be a tourist. Okay, a tourist is someone who never really gets involved. You just kind of pass through, right? You speak your language, you stay in your group, and you eat your food, and you look for a Starbucks, right? That would have been me. So you kind of look for those things that are very familiar with you, and that's the attitude of a lot of Christians have toward this world. We stay separated and never really get deeply involved and own where we live. So we kind of think, I'm only going to, be here on earth a short time, so I better protect myself in this kind of holy bubble. And so I attend 5 different churches and 17 different Bible studies each week, and I only make friends with those who are Christians who think exactly like I think. Again, that's a wrong perspective, and see why. Because the third perspective is what I think what we should have, and it's what Peter talks about here in the book of 1 Peter, in this letter he's writing to these exiles, as we mentioned last week. He says you can have the third perspective of an exile, which is you're not trying to become an immigrant because you know that you're a citizen of heaven. But you also realize that for a time you are stationed here and you need to plant your life here so you don't live as a tourist. So in this letter, Peter addresses this group of people who were exiles, forced to leave their homes, and he gives them a new perspective on how to now live in this new place that God has placed them. And Peter's actually going to take this idea of exile and expand it more to that of an ambassador or a missionary. He's going to, and an ambassador is one who is sent from one country on a mission to another country with some type of purpose. An ambassador, they help bridge relationships. They are sent from one country to represent them in another country. So Peter is actually going to kind of take this idea of being this chosen exile, and he's going to give it more of an ambassador and even a missionary language, as we're going to look at in just a second. And this is exactly what God helped the Israelites, exiles, understand when they were taken captive to Babylon several hundred years ago. So these who Peter is writing to, he's actually kind of almost like he has in mind what God was telling the people of Israel who were sent to exile in Jeremiah 29. And this comes from verse 4 through 7 of Jeremiah 29. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles I deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. This is around 586 BC. He said, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Find wives for yourselves and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters to men in marriage so that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. Pursue the well-being of the city I have deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, and when it thrives, you will thrive. He doesn't tell them just become exiles who are really no better than slaves in the country they are exiled to. They're really in some type of bondage or under some type of oppression as an exile. He understands that, but he says flourish, thrive. Notice the strong verbs he said there: build, live, plant, find, multiply, pursue. All these things are very active things he tells them to do as exiles. So it's almost like Peter's kind of taking this imagery and he's helping the modern day Christians of this time to understand how they too can live as these exiles, not as oppressed exiles, but actually as sent ambassadors and missionaries. So God actually sent the Israelites into exile as punishment, but he gave them a new perspective on how to live there, not as immigrants or tourists, but exiles with a holy purpose. So he says, plant your lives here and plant the gospel here. So God's plan for us to live as spiritual exiles on earth is not about a punishment, but about a purpose. And that's really what I want us to see today in our section in 1 Peter. So throughout this letter, the Apostle Peter is going to show us that exile is really better equated with missionary or ambassador. He says, that's why he says in verse 1 that we are chosen exiles. We're not just thrown out there to be exiles. We were actually chosen very specifically and on purpose to be exiles. And if you remember from last week, I explained part of that purpose was God was actually using this dispersion of the Christians by the Roman emperor to actually spread the gospel further and further in the known world. So there was actually a very missionary endeavor of God to let this oppression and this dispersion happened because it forced Christians to spread, and everywhere they went, they took the gospel. More people became followers of Christ, and more churches were started. So, what we need is a new perspective on living out God's purposes in a place that is not truly our home. It's not viewing ourselves as just permanent residents, but exiles sent with a holy purpose. And this is why we're studying 1 Peter for a few weeks in our sermon series called Hope Lives On. Because COVID has really brought a difficult situation, trial, as we looked last week, to the whole world. I mean, it has ruined so many pieces of our daily lives between finances and our mental health and our kids' education and travel and seeing family and everything in between has now just been kind of upended and almost ruined in many ways. But we're 6 months into this. 6 months into this. We've kind of figured out the new normal. It's very normal for me when I walk out the door, I stick a mask in my pocket. It's normal that whenever I walk into a store, the first thing I look for is the hand sanitizer station. And when I'm standing in line, I'm imagining how much is 2 meters away from this person in front of me, and I'm looking behind saying, hey bud, that ain't 2 meters. Right? So we have this kind of new normal now, but we're still kind of living under this oppression, so to speak. We're kind of still enduring through this trial. And so as a church and you as a Christian, we may be tempted to retreat from God's mission and purpose for us during a hard, difficult time like this COVID situation has brought. And I'm sure you've been in some other type of situation, maybe pre-COVID, even during COVID now, that is really is a trial or a suffering or something very difficult happening to you, where you really just wanted to retreat from God, to step away from Him, to just kind of step away from the church and say, you know what, if life is going to be this tough, I just completely give up. So here's those two questions I want us to consider as we go through the sermon today. How can we grow Hope Church and reach more people if we haven't been able to gather for worship in a normal way for at least 6 months? You know, how are we as a church going to grow and we're reaching more and more people with the gospel, helping more and more people find their hope in Christ? How are we going to do that when it is really difficult to gather in person together? And how can I meet new people to share the gospel with if I'm supposed to maintain all this physical distancing and limit my personal interactions? These are the tough questions that COVID has asked us and has forced us to ask, because we want to be missionaries in this culture. We want to obey what Peter is asking these exiles to do. We want to live this way, but we're finding it increasingly more difficult. So often these type of questions just cause us to kind of give up, retreat, and back away. But Peter wants us to wake up to the fact that this time in history, for us as Christians right now, during this COVID pandemic, it is actually our missionary moment as Hope Church. This is our moment not to retreat, but to reach out. And so we're going to look at that more in depth today, and actually we're going to build on that in the next several weeks as we keep going through the letter of 1 Peter. So today I want you to see how hope lives on in you personally. You know, whenever you're flying, they always do the demonstration of how to put a seatbelt on, where all the exits are, and then they show you how the oxygen mask. If something were to happen, the mask fall down, they tell you to first put yours on before you help someone else. Today's sermon is about kind of helping you prepare for helping others. You got to get yourself in line first. You got to work on your heart and your mind first, and then you can start helping others, because I'm sure COVID or anything else has probably messed you up a little bit. I know it has me. But if it's messed you up a little bit, let's find ways today from this passage to help ourselves so that we can go and help others. So I want to read our passage today. It comes from 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13. It says, "Therefore, with your minds ready for action, be sober-minded, and set your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires of your former ignorance, but as the one who called you is holy, you also are to be holy in all your conduct. For it is written, 'Be holy because I am holy.' If you appeal to the Father who judges impartially according to each one's work, you are to conduct yourselves in reverence during your time living as strangers," kind of where we are now as COVID. "For you know that you were redeemed or bought back from your empty way of life inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of an unblemished and spotless lamb. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for you. Through him you believed in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God." In these verses, we see three things that we need transformed if we are to live as God wants us to live. The first is a transformation of our minds. The second is a transformation of our conduct. And the third is a transformation of our interaction and love for one another. So the very first word there in verse 13 is therefore. And that connects us back to what we discussed last week. Therefore, in light of the fact that you're now in this trial, this time of suffering, very difficult right now, here's how you can make it through these tough times and trials and suffering, like COVID or marital problems or physical sickness, what have you, with God's help. So enduring and thriving during a difficult trial requires that we have a new perspective that starts with a change in mindset and progresses with a change in conduct. So it starts with our minds, you help yourself first, and then that actually flows out and helps change your conduct. We'll look at that in a couple of ways. So let's look at the change of mindset first. Our first main point that I want us to kind of highlight today is that hope lives on when you let God transform your mindset. Okay, that comes in verse 13. He says there, with your minds ready for action. Now, this speaks of our minds being prepared and ready. It's best if we are mentally prepared before a trial happens, but often they just surprise us, kind of like COVID. We kind of saw things happening in other parts of the world, but I think if you were like me, you probably thought, hey, it's not going to come here like that. Canada will be fine. 6 months later, we've been in lockdown. So I was wrong. You probably were too. But it would have been nice if we could have better prepared. I would have stocked up on hand sanitizer, and I would have stocked up on toilet paper, because that was a thing. Do you remember that? The toilet paper crisis of March 2020, April 2020. Do you remember that? Anyways, it seems like so long ago. Now, the Greek wording here is actually quite funny. The Greek phrase here with your minds ready for action is gird up the loins of your mind. Now, loins are kind of like the old-fashioned word for your midsection, all right? So in this time period, they kind of wore these kind of robes and tunics, and whenever they needed to get somewhere in a hurry or run, they would kind of pull up and tuck their robe into their belt so it wouldn't be dragging by their legs and they could run a little more freely. So that's what it meant to gird up their loins. So here, Peter is saying, just like you kind of get your robe and tunic kind of tucked in and get ready for something, kind of prepare your mind in the same way. So we can kind of translate this as roll up your sleeves because you're about to get ready for movement, for quick movement, for action. And so with this ready and prepared mindset, Peter gives them two charges. First, he says, be sober-minded. This is simply free of outside or controlling influences. Sober, we often relate to alcoholism. If someone struggles with alcoholism and they are sober, it means that at the time of their sobriety, they are no longer being controlled and influenced by the substance of alcohol. And so here he's saying being sober-minded. Just let your mind be free of any outside influence except for the gospel, as he's going to explain in just a second. And then he says this, set your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. This is another reminder that our true hope is Jesus and his grace, not ourselves or anything we believe will bring us lasting hope in this life. And so these three things all speak to a transformation of our mindset through the gospel. Minds made ready for action by Jesus, nothing controlling or influencing our mindset other than Jesus, and our minds completely focused on our hope in Jesus. So the second thing he says, and I want us to highlight, is that hope lives on when you ask God to transform your conduct. So it starts with our mindset. Now we're moving to our conduct. We see this in verses 14 through 18. He says, as obedient children, do not be conformed or fashioned by the desires of your former ignorance, the way you used to live in your sin. But as the one who called you is holy, you also are to be holy in all your conduct, in all your activity, your doings. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. There he's quoting Leviticus 19:2, where God was preparing the people of Israel to go into this promised land of Canaan when all the surrounding pagan tribes and villages and towns and nations were all very, very wicked. He actually highlights that in Leviticus 18. He says, don't do these really sinful, crazy, messed up things, including sacrificing your children by burning them to the false god Molech. He says, don't be like them, but be holy because I am holy. And he actually explains what that means in Leviticus 19. So holiness simply means separated or set apart. So God is holy because he is separate from everything else in creation. There is nothing else in creation that exists like God. He is completely separate. Nothing compares to him. He is unique and one of a kind. So how can we be holy? He says, you be holy like I am. Well, we can't be God. We can't be exactly like him in that way. We can't be completely other than anything else in creation that is only set aside for God. So how can we be holy if only God is holy? Are we separate from all of creation just like God? Well, not quite. The idea in the Bible is that we are made holy by God's salvation through Jesus. He says this in verse 18 to 19, helps us understand this. For you know that you were redeemed from your empty or unholy way of life, inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold. In other words, not with something that you could buy. You can't purchase your holiness by writing a check or swiping a credit card or tapping, but with the precious blood of Christ. The blood of Christ was the currency that paid the price of our sin. So Jesus makes us holy or set apart or separated because we are now different than what we were. So we don't attain God's type of holiness, but we are set apart or unlike others who have not yet been transformed by the gospel. We're different. That's exactly what he's saying. You are now different. You are separated. Not better than others, as if we were a higher class of human now that we are Christians, but separate from in the sense that we have a unique identity, purpose, and calling in Jesus Christ. So our holiness is for the sake of God's mission, not for the sake of our own pride. So notice holiness, he relates it here to our conduct in verse 17. You are to conduct yourselves in reverence during your time living as strangers. Because you're holy, your actions have now changed. So holiness fosters right kind of living. And our right living is a display of God's holiness to others. And the third thing I want to highlight here is that hope lives on when you intentionally love others. So hope lives on when our minds are transformed by the gospel. Hope lives on when we are asking God to make us holy and transform our hearts and then our actions. And then hope lives on when we are intentional and letting God transform how we relate to other people. He says this in verses 22 to 23. Since you have purified yourselves by your obedience to the truth, so that you show sincere brotherly love for each other from a pure heart, love one another constantly, because you have been born again. So Peter gives the command to love one another 4 different times in this letter. So it's a pretty big deal. As we want to keep studying the rest of the letter, we want to see, he's going to say love one another 4 times in this whole letter. So we must be here for each other, not just in words, but also in actions flowing from the idea of living or having a holy conduct in our present situation. So if our minds are ready for action and thinking clearly, we'll be able to notice when someone is struggling. Right? This is happening a lot with the extra stress that COVID has brought. We are seeing friends and family, and something's just a little bit off with them. They seem extra stressed. They're a little extra snappy. All right? Maybe they fuss a little bit too much. But there's a lot of mental stress that is happening to so many people right now because of this current COVID situation. So if we have our minds clear, remember the whole mask coming down from the airplane. If we have our minds clear, thinking sober-minded, and our hope is clear, everything is ready with our mindset has been transformed by God, and then our conduct has been transformed, then we are better able to see how we can help those around us and demonstrate love. So if we try to live as holy people, we will conduct ourselves or do things that demonstrate love to others while they are struggling in very tangible ways. We've seen this so many ways, demonstrated in so many ways here at our church. There have been so many of you. Some of you have mentioned things, and some other people have mentioned things that you did where you just simply showed a simple act of love and kindness to someone else in our church family when they were struggling. And that is what we are here for. And that's why Peter says, listen, during a tough situation, during a trial, while you're living as exiles, in this kind of hostile and oppressed environment, you have to focus on loving one another. That will keep you going. Love needs to be sincere, and it needs to be shown. So, as we kind of wrap up today, I want you to notice how Jesus is our hope and our hero during trials and suffering from this passage. And he helps us to live with this new perspective, not as an immigrant or as a tourist, but as a purposeful exile. It's actually, Jesus is actually the one who helps us understand this. Notice in verse 13, Jesus is our only source of lasting, trustworthy, forever hope. He eases our minds. In verse 15, He's the only one who calls us to be holy like Him, and He actually helps us to live those holy lives. He redeemed us from the way that we used to live so that we can now live holy. He did that for us. Something that we could not do for ourselves, Christ did for us. In verse 18, it says, He is our Redeemer who saved us from an empty life of no meaning and purpose. And then in verse 23, He is true love who gives us the opportunity to be born again because of His suffering. So here we see that Jesus is our hope and hero for figuring out how to have our mindset transformed, to have our conduct be holy and mirroring God, and also how we can love one another and help each other make it through this time of trial and suffering. Listen, Christian, you are a chosen exile, sent to your circles of influence, your friends, your family, your neighbors, your coworkers, to help them find hope in Jesus Christ. So don't be a spiritual immigrant, finding hope and comfort in the things of this present life. They will fade and fail you. Don't be a spiritual tourist who you are seeing your holiness as an excuse to avoid people who have not yet been made holy. Jesus used His holiness not to come near us, but to heal us, not to separate Himself from us, but to come and be with us. So why would we use our holiness as some excuse to why we can't be around our friends, our neighbors, those in our circles of influence who are desperately needing the same hope that you have? But we won't give them any kind of attention or time because we don't want some of their rough and maybe even wrong behavior to rub off on us. I'm so glad Jesus did not have that perspective. He came, He said, I'm going to dwell among these sinful, dirty people, these broken, messed up humans. I'm going to come and live among them. I'm going to use my holiness to heal them, not to hurt them. And thirdly, do be a chosen exile, living as a sent missionary with a calling and purpose to think as a missionary, to conduct yourself as a missionary, and to love like a missionary, because that's what Jesus did for us. And we can only do this if we first let hope live on in ourselves, as we have our minds focused on God's agenda, as we have our conduct mirroring our holy God, and our hearts sincerely showing love to each other. Let's pray. God, thank You for Your word today. Thank You that You give us very practical, spiritual wisdom to understand how we are to live during a trial, during a tough situation. Whether it's COVID, a marital problem, trouble with a child, a mental or physical sickness, whatever it is, God, You actually step alongside of us, and You're our hope and our hero to help us not live as immigrants or as just tourists in this present world, but as purposeful exiles, sent ambassadors, missionaries with a greater purpose, to have our minds ready and transformed so that our conduct can mirror Your holiness and not our brokenness. And then we can have our conduct be something that is a light to those around us who don't yet know how much You care for them, don't yet know the beauty of Your salvation. And then it also helps us to just practically love each other. One another, it helps us love each other here in our church family, in our community. So God, thank You that Your word has taught us that today. Help us to internalize these truths, help us to live out these truths, and help us display these truths to others. And we ask for Your help, Holy Spirit, because we can't do this on our own. We can't transform our mindset. We need You to do it. We cannot make ourselves holy. We needed You to do it. And we struggle to love others, and we need You to help us do that. So we are dependent on You, God, but we know that You will, when we pray and ask, You will step alongside and You will help us. So Father, thank You for that promise. Help us to live out of it today as we try to see how our hope can live on in each of us individually. God, we love You, and we thank You for this time in Your word today. Amen. Well, I want to thank you for joining us for worship this morning. And again, if you're a first-time guest, we would love to connect with you a little bit more, to get to know you a little bit better, answer some questions you have about our church, and even maybe get you connected in some way, whether it's online or in person. Fill out that Connect card, and we'd love to chat with you a little bit more. And speaking of in person, we have a very exciting announcement to make. Starting October the 4th, Hope Church will be gathering really in 2 locations. We, because of COVID, we have been kind of pushed to become one church with 2 locations. Here's what I mean. We have an online location, just like what you're watching right now, where for the next, for the foreseeable future, those of you who aren't quite ready to be in an in-person gathering, you can continue to join and worship with us online every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. So that's going to be kind of our first location, if you will. But we're also going to be adding an in-person location starting October the 4th. So on October the 4th at 10:30 a.m., we will be at the Hamptons Golf Club. Hamptons is the community right across Stony Trail below Sherwood. So you can actually see it from Costco and Beacon Hill. Right across is the golf course. So it only takes about 7 or 8 minutes to get there from my house in Nolan Hill. So it's not far at all. Very easy to get to, and they're letting us use their ballroom for our worship services. It's quite a large room. We've been there twice already to kind of practice set up and get things ready for those of you who are ready to join us in person. So we're taking every safety precaution. We're going to have things marked out and roped off, and we're going to have tables and seats very well spread out across the room, and we'll have face masks will be required. We'll have hand sanitizing stations, all those things. And so we're excited to be able to join back in person again very soon. But I want you who aren't quite ready for that in person to know that you being here on the online is just as important as being in person. So we want you to feel like we are one church with 2 different locations, an online location and an in-person location. So we'll be sending out more details and publishing more through email and text and even video like this. And so we'll be giving you more details, but go ahead and put down October the 4th, Sunday, October 4th, at 10:30 a.m. at the Hamptons Golf Club here in Northwest Calgary. So we're excited to get back. Now we're only going to do the first and third Sunday there at Hamptons. We're not going to quite do every single Sunday. We want to see how it goes. We've waited till October to kind of see how school reopening goes. And so if we have to stop because something crazy happens, then we can easily pull back. But right now we're going to be gathering together in person on the first and third Sundays all through December. And then, but every single Sunday, we're still going to have online happening as well. And so thanks for sticking with us as we have been figuring out this new way of expressing church here for our church family. And so thanks for sticking with us, for being patient, but also want to encourage you to be very involved in either online or in person, whichever way that you feel most comfortable with as well. And as I mentioned before, today at 4 p.m., if you would like to join us on the field at Bearspaw Christian School, we're having a very simple worship celebration service to kind of celebrate our 2nd birthday as a church. So I would love for you to come and join us at 4 p.m. We'll have live music with our worship pastor C-Sung. It'll be the same sermon again. So if you watched all this, well, you're going to hear the same thing. But maybe I'll try to make it a little bit shorter. But anyways, we'd love to see you today at 4. And also we will be starting our community groups here very soon. And so we're putting together details. We're going to have online groups and what we're calling cohort groups, which are 2-3 families getting together. So a lot is happening right now. September is turning out to be a very crazy busy month for our church staff, but we are putting everything together and things are coming into place nicely, and we'll keep you updated in regular communication so you know how you can be a part of what God is doing in and through Hope Church. So thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next week.